The ambulance sirens cut through the afternoon silence as they rushed through the busy streets of downtown Chicago. Inside, paramedic Sarah Chen worked quickly on a middle-aged woman who had been struck by a car while crossing the street. The patient, later identified as Elena Rodriguez, lay unconscious on the stretcher with multiple injuries. Sarah had been working as a paramedic for 8 years. She was known for her calm demeanor and quick thinking during emergencies. Her colleagues respected her ability to handle even the most stressful situations without losing her composure. Today seemed like any other day until she began examining Elena more closely. As Sarah cut away Elena's blood-soaked jacket to assess her injuries, something caught her eye. On Elena's left shoulder, partially hidden by her torn shirt, was a distinctive scar. It was not the kind of scar you get from an accident or surgery. Sarah recognized it immediately because she had seen similar marks before during her medical training. It was a bullet wound scar, old and well-healed but unmistakable. The ambulance hit a bump and Elena's shirt shifted further, revealing more scars on her arm and torso. Sarah's hands moved automatically, applying pressure to stop the bleeding from Elena's head wound, but her mind was racing. These were not random scars. They formed a pattern that told a story of survival, violence, and perhaps something much more significant. Elena's breathing was shallow but steady. Her pulse was weak but regular. Sarah administered oxygen and started an IV line while keeping a close eye on her vital signs. The woman appeared to be in her 50s with graying hair and calloused hands that suggested years of hard work. Her clothing was simple but clean, and she wore no jewelry except for a small silver cross around her neck. As they approached the hospital, Sarah noticed something else unusual. Elena's hands, despite being those of someone who clearly worked with them, had small scars between her fingers. These were precise, deliberate marks that Sarah had only read about in medical journals. They were the kind of scars left by torture instruments, specifically thin wires or needles used to extract information. The hospital came into view, and Sarah's partner Mike began radioing ahead to the emergency room with Elena's condition. Sarah continued monitoring the woman's vital signs while her mind tried to process what she was seeing. Who was this woman? What had happened to her? The scars suggested a history of violence that went far beyond anything a typical civilian would experience. Elena's eyes suddenly fluttered open for a brief moment. She looked directly at Sarah with clear, intelligent eyes that seemed to assess everything around her in seconds. Despite her injuries and obvious pain, there was something alert and calculating in her gaze. It was the look of someone who had trained themselves to evaluate threats and opportunities, even in the worst circumstances. Sarah leaned closer and spoke softly, telling Elena that she was safe and on her way to the hospital. Elena tried to speak but could only manage a whisper. Sarah strained to hear, thinking the woman might be trying to give her name or contact information for family members. Instead, Elena said something in what sounded like Spanish, followed by a few words in another language Sarah could not identify. The ambulance pulled into the hospital emergency bay, and the doors flew open. The medical team was waiting and immediately took over Elena's care. As they transferred her to a hospital gurney, Sarah found herself staring at the woman's face. Even unconscious and injured, there was something about Elena that suggested strength and resilience beyond what most people possessed. Sarah helped wheel Elena into the emergency room and gave her report to Dr. Martinez, the attending physician. She described Elena's injuries, vital signs, and treatment provided during transport. However, Sarah found herself hesitating when it came to mentioning the scars she had observed. Something told her that Elena's history might be more complicated than a simple accident victim. As the medical team worked on Elena, Sarah completed her paperwork and prepared to return to service. She could not shake the feeling that she had just encountered someone with an extraordinary past. The scars, the alert eyes, the way Elena had immediately assessed her surroundings even while injured. Everything pointed to someone who had lived through experiences most people could never imagine. Before leaving the hospital, Sarah made a decision that surprised even herself. She asked the charge nurse to call her if Elena woke up and asked for her. Sarah left her contact information, saying she wanted to follow up on the patient's condition. In reality, she was deeply curious about the woman whose scars told a story she desperately wanted to understand. 3 days later, Sarah received the call she had been hoping for. Elena Rodriguez was awake and asking to speak with the paramedic who had treated her. Sarah finished her shift early and drove to Chicago General Hospital, her curiosity growing with each mile. She had not been able to stop thinking about Elena and the mysterious scars that told a story of survival. When Sarah entered Elena's hospital room, she was surprised to see how different the woman looked. Alert and sitting up in bed, Elena's eyes held the same calculating intelligence Sarah had noticed in the ambulance. But now there was also warmth and gratitude. Elena smiled and extended her hand, speaking in clear English with only a slight accent. Elena thanked Sarah for her care and professionalism during the ambulance ride. She explained that she remembered everything that had happened, including Sarah's gentle reassurance during those frightening moments. As they talked, Sarah found herself drawn to Elena's calm presence, and the way she seemed to choose her words carefully, as if she was used to keeping secrets. The conversation remained polite and surface level for several minutes, until Elena suddenly looked directly at Sarah and said something that changed everything. She told Sarah that she knew the paramedic had seen her scars and was curious about them. Elena's directness caught Sarah off guard, but she admitted that she had indeed noticed the old wounds and wondered about their origin. Elena was quiet for a long moment, studying Sarah's face as if deciding whether to trust her. Finally, she began to speak about her past, but not in the way Sarah had expected. Elena started by talking about her current life in Chicago, where she worked as a cleaning lady in office buildings and lived quietly in a small apartment on the South Side. She had been in the United States for 15 years and had built a simple, peaceful life for herself. But Elena's story took an unexpected turn when she mentioned her homeland. She had been born in El Salvador during one of the most violent periods in the country's history. The civil war that raged from 1979 to 1992 had torn families apart and forced millions of people to make impossible choices. Elena's family had been caught in the middle of this conflict, trying to survive while violence surrounded them on all sides. As Elena continued her story, Sarah began to understand that the woman lying in the hospital bed had lived through experiences that most people could never imagine. Elena spoke carefully about her youth, describing how the war had forced her family to flee their village when she was just 17 years old. They had lost everything and were forced to seek refuge in the mountains with other displaced families. Elena explained that during those years in hiding, she had learned skills that most young women never needed to know. She had learned to move silently through forests, to identify the sounds of different weapons from a distance, and to treat wounds with whatever materials were available. The war had taken away her childhood but had given her abilities that would later save her life many times over. The scars on Elena's body, she revealed, were not from random violence but from a specific incident that had changed the course of her life. When she was 19, Elena and several other young people from her refugee group had been captured by government soldiers who suspected them of supporting the guerrilla fighters. They had been taken to a detention center where they were interrogated and tortured for information they did not possess. Elena's voice remained steady as she described those dark weeks, but Sarah could see the pain in her eyes. The soldiers had used various methods to try to break Elena and her fellow prisoners, leaving the physical scars that Sarah had noticed. But Elena had survived by staying silent and protecting the others in her group, even when the pain became almost unbearable. After 3 weeks in detention, Elena and the other survivors had been released due to pressure from international human rights organizations. But Elena knew that her life in El Salvador was no longer safe. She had become a target, and staying in the country would mean certain death. With the help of family members who had already fled to the United States, Elena began planning her own escape. As Elena finished this part of her story, Sarah realized that she was listening to someone who had shown extraordinary courage under circumstances that would have broken most people. Elena's calm demeanor in the ambulance suddenly made perfect sense. After surviving torture and war, a car accident was just another challenge to overcome. Elena looked at Sarah and smiled, saying that she had not told this story to many people since arriving in the United States. Most Americans, she explained, found it difficult to understand what people in other parts of the world had endured. But something about Sarah's professional care and genuine concern had made Elena feel safe enough to share her past. Sarah left the hospital that evening with her mind full of questions and a deep respect for Elena's strength. She had expected to satisfy her curiosity about the mysterious scars, but instead she had discovered that Elena's story was far more complex and remarkable than she could have imagined. Over the following weeks, Sarah found herself visiting Elena regularly during her recovery. What had started as professional concern had grown into genuine friendship, and Elena seemed to appreciate having someone to talk to who did not judge her past. During one of these visits, Elena revealed a part of her story that she had never shared with anyone in America. After escaping El Salvador, Elena's journey to the United States had not been direct or simple. She had first fled to Nicaragua, where she lived in a refugee camp for 2 years. The conditions were harsh, with limited food, poor sanitation, and constant uncertainty about the future. But Elena had used this time to learn new skills that would prove invaluable in the years to come. In the refugee camp, Elena met Dr. Maria Santos, a volunteer physician from Spain who was working with Doctors Without Borders. Dr. Santos had been treating wounded civilians and refugees, and she quickly recognized Elena's intelligence and natural ability to remain calm under pressure. She began training Elena as a medical assistant, teaching her to treat wounds, assist with surgeries, and manage medical supplies. Elena's hands, which had once worked in her family's small farm in El Salvador, learned to suture wounds and administer medications. Dr. Santos was impressed by Elena's dedication and her ability to comfort patients who were suffering from both physical injuries and psychological trauma. Elena had found her calling in helping others heal from the violence that had affected so many lives. When Dr. Santos was transferred to work in refugee camps in Honduras, she asked Elena to come with her as her assistant. Elena agreed, knowing that this opportunity would allow her to continue learning while staying safely away from El Salvador. For the next 3 years, Elena worked alongside Dr. Santos in some of the most challenging conditions imaginable. In Honduras, Elena treated gunshot wounds, helped deliver babies in unsanitary conditions, and provided comfort to families who had lost everything. She learned to work with limited supplies, often having to improvise treatments when proper medical equipment was not available. Elena also learned to speak English from other international volunteers, adding to her knowledge of Spanish and her native language. During her time in Honduras, Elena encountered refugees from many different conflicts. She met people fleeing violence in Guatemala, Nicaragua, and other Central American countries. Each person had a story of survival, and Elena learned that her own experiences, while traumatic, were part of a much larger pattern of suffering and resilience that affected millions of people throughout the region. It was in Honduras that Elena first learned about the possibility of coming to the United States. Dr. Santos had connections with immigration lawyers who specialized in helping refugees with medical training obtain asylum. Elena's skills as a medical assistant, combined with her documented history of persecution in El Salvador, made her a strong candidate for refugee status. The application process was long and complicated, requiring extensive documentation of Elena's experiences and proof of the persecution she had faced. Elena had to relive the trauma of her detention and torture through interviews with immigration officials and medical examinations to document her scars. It was emotionally exhausting, but Elena remained focused on her goal of reaching safety. While waiting for her application to be processed, Elena continued working in the refugee camps. She had become an experienced medical assistant, capable of handling emergencies and training other refugees in basic medical care. Dr. Santos wrote strong letters of recommendation, describing Elena's skills and dedication to helping others. Elena also used this time to prepare for life in the United States. She studied English more intensively, learned about American culture from volunteers and other refugees who had family in the United States, and saved every dollar she could from her small salary. She knew that starting over in a new country would be challenging, especially with her limited formal education. After 4 years of waiting, Elena finally received approval for her refugee application. The relief she felt was overwhelming, but it was also mixed with sadness about leaving Dr. Santos and the friends she had made in the camps. These people had become her family during some of the most difficult years of her life. Elena's journey to the United States began with a flight from Honduras to Miami, followed by a bus ride to Chicago, where a refugee resettlement organization had found her a sponsor family. She carried only a small bag with her few belongings and the medical training certificates that Dr. Santos had helped her obtain. As Elena finished this part of her story, Sarah realized that the quiet cleaning lady she had met in the ambulance had once been a skilled medical assistant, who had saved countless lives. Elena's calm behavior during the accident suddenly made even more sense. She'd spent years dealing with medical emergencies. Under much more difficult circumstances, Sarah asked Elena why she had not continued working in medicine after arriving in the United States. Elena's expression grew sad as she explained that her foreign training was not recognized by American medical institutions. Despite her years of experience, she would have needed to complete extensive additional education and certification programs that she could not afford. Instead, Elena had taken whatever work she could find to survive. She had worked in restaurants, hotels, and eventually found steady employment as a cleaning lady. It was honest work that allowed her to support herself and send small amounts of money back to family members who were still struggling in El Salvador. But Elena had never stopped missing the satisfaction of helping people heal. As Elena recovered from her injuries, Sarah began to understand the depth of her new friend's medical knowledge. During one visit, Sarah mentioned a challenging case she had handled that day involving a patient with multiple trauma injuries. Elena listened carefully and then offered insights that surprised Sarah with their accuracy and sophistication. Elena described treatment approaches that Sarah had not considered, drawing from her experience in refugee camps where medical supplies were limited and creativity was essential. She explained techniques for managing pain without proper medications, ways to prevent infection in unsanitary conditions, and methods for keeping patients calm during traumatic situations. Sarah realized that Elena's knowledge was not just theoretical, but came from years of hands-on experience. Word of Elena's medical background began to spread through the hospital staff. Dr. Martinez, who had treated Elena in the emergency room, was fascinated to learn about her experience with Doctors Without Borders. He visited Elena's room to discuss some of the challenging cases he had encountered and was impressed by her insights and practical knowledge. Other medical professionals began stopping by Elena's room to chat with her about her experiences. Nurses were particularly interested in her techniques for comforting patients who had experienced trauma, and several doctors asked about her methods for treating wounds with limited resources. Elena found herself enjoying these conversations and feeling useful again, in a way she had not experienced since leaving the refugee camps. Sarah began to see how much Elena missed working in medicine. Despite the traumatic circumstances that had led to her medical training, Elena had clearly found purpose and satisfaction in helping people heal. Her eyes lit up when she talked about successful treatments and the patients she had helped save. Sarah could see the pain Elena felt at having to abandon this calling when she came to America. One afternoon, Dr. Martinez approached Sarah with an idea that would change Elena's life. He had been thinking about Elena's skills and experience, and he wondered if there might be a way to help her return to medical work. While her foreign training could not be directly transferred to American certification, her practical experience was invaluable and could potentially be recognized in certain settings. Dr. Martinez explained that the hospital had been struggling to find qualified medical interpreters who could also assist with patient care in the emergency room. Many of their Spanish-speaking patients came from Central America and had experienced trauma similar to what Elena had survived. These patients often felt more comfortable with caregivers who understood their experiences and could communicate with them effectively. The position Dr. Martinez had in mind would not require full medical certification but would allow Elena to use her language skills, cultural knowledge, and medical experience to help patients. She would work alongside certified medical professionals, translating not just language, but also helping patients understand treatments and feel more comfortable in the hospital environment. Sarah was excited about this possibility and immediately shared the idea with Elena. Elena's reaction was more cautious than Sarah had expected. She explained that she had learned to keep her past hidden in order to protect herself and avoid unwanted attention. Working in a hospital setting would mean revealing her history to more people and potentially putting herself at risk. Elena's concerns were not unfounded. Even though many years had passed since the civil war in El Salvador, she still received occasional threats from people who opposed her political views or who blamed refugees for various problems in their communities. Elena had learned to live quietly and avoid drawing attention to herself as a survival strategy. Sarah listened to Elena's concerns and understood her caution. She asked Elena what would make her feel safe enough to consider returning to medical work. Elena thought carefully before answering. She said she would need to trust that the hospital administration would protect her privacy and that her colleagues would respect her need for discretion about certain aspects of her past. Over the next few days, Elena considered the opportunity Dr. Martinez had presented. She realized that she missed helping people heal more than she had admitted to herself. The years of working as a cleaning lady had been necessary for survival, but they had not given her the sense of purpose she had felt when working with Dr. Santos in the refugee camps. Elena also thought about the patients she could help. She had seen how scared and confused Spanish-speaking patients became when they could not communicate effectively with medical staff. She remembered her own fear during her early days in America, when she could not understand what doctors were telling her. Elena knew she could make a real difference for these patients. Finally, Elena made her decision. She would accept the position if Dr. Martinez could guarantee certain protections for her privacy and safety. She wanted to use an abbreviated version of her name on official documents and requested that her specific country of origin not be included in her personnel file. These precautions would help protect her while still allowing her to use her skills to help others. Dr. Martinez agreed to Elena's conditions and began the process of creating the new position. The hospital administration was supportive of the idea, especially after learning about Elena's extensive experience and the positive feedback she had received from medical staff who had met her during her recovery. Sarah felt proud to have played a role in helping Elena find a way back to the work she loved. She realized that her decision to follow up on Elena's case had led to an outcome that would benefit not just Elena but also the many patients who would receive better care because of Elena's unique combination of medical knowledge, language skills, and cultural understanding. As Elena prepared to start her new job, she reflected on the strange path that had brought her to this moment. A car accident that could have ended her life had instead led to an opportunity to return to the medical work that had given her life meaning. Sometimes, Elena thought, the most unexpected events could lead to the most important changes. Elena's first day as a medical interpreter and patient advocate at Chicago General Hospital brought back memories she had not expected. As she walked through the emergency room in her new hospital scrubs, the familiar sounds and smells transported her back to the refugee camps where she had first learned to heal others. The beeping of monitors, the urgent voices of medical staff, and the sight of people in pain were all achingly familiar. Dr. Martinez introduced Elena to the emergency room staff during the morning briefing. He explained her background carefully, mentioning her extensive experience with trauma patients and her ability to communicate with Spanish-speaking patients who had experienced violence or persecution. Several nurses and doctors welcomed Elena warmly, expressing hope that her presence would improve care for their most vulnerable patients. Elena's first case came within hours of starting her shift. A young Guatemalan woman named Rosa had been brought in after collapsing at her job in a restaurant kitchen. Rosa was terrified and spoke no English, and the medical staff was struggling to understand her symptoms and medical history. When Elena approached Rosa's bedside and spoke to her in gentle Spanish, the relief on the young woman's face was immediate. Through careful questioning, Elena learned that Rosa had been experiencing severe abdominal pain for weeks but had been afraid to seek medical attention because of her undocumented status. She had been working double shifts to send money to her family in Guatemala and had been ignoring her symptoms until the pain became unbearable. Elena translated this information to Dr. Martinez while also comforting Rosa and explaining each step of the medical examination. As Elena worked with Rosa, she noticed signs that reminded her of her own experiences and those of other refugees she had known. Rosa's fearful glances toward the door, her reluctance to provide personal information, and her immediate assumption that she would be turned away from the hospital all spoke to the trauma and vulnerability that many undocumented immigrants experienced. Elena's ability to communicate with Rosa went beyond simple translation. She understood the cultural context of Rosa's fears and could explain medical procedures in ways that made sense to someone from a rural Guatemalan background. Elena also knew how to ask questions that would elicit important medical information without making Rosa feel threatened or judged. The medical team discovered that Rosa was suffering from appendicitis and needed emergency surgery. Elena stayed with Rosa throughout the preoperative process, explaining what would happen and reassuring her that the hospital would not report her immigration status to authorities. Elena's presence seemed to calm Rosa significantly, and she was able to give proper consent for the surgery with full understanding of the procedure. While Rosa was in surgery, Elena was called to help with another case. A middle-aged man from Honduras had been brought in after a construction accident that had left him with a broken leg and possible internal injuries. Like Rosa, he spoke no English and was frightened about his medical situation and potential legal consequences. As Elena worked with this patient, named Carlos, she began to see a pattern that would define much of her work at the hospital. Many of the Spanish-speaking patients who came to the emergency room were undocumented immigrants who worked in dangerous jobs with little protection. They often delayed seeking medical care because of fear and financial concerns, which meant their conditions were more serious by the time they arrived at the hospital. Elena's experience in refugee camps had prepared her well for this type of work. She knew how to quickly assess not just a patient's medical needs, but also their emotional and psychological state. She could identify signs of trauma, fear, and distrust that might interfere with treatment, and she knew how to address these issues while working with the medical team. By the end of her first week, Elena had worked with dozens of patients from various Central and South American countries. Each case was different, but Elena found that her combination of medical knowledge, language skills, and personal experience with trauma made her uniquely effective at helping these patients receive proper care. The hospital staff quickly recognized Elena's value to their team. Nurses began specifically requesting her assistance with Spanish-speaking patients, and doctors praised her ability to obtain accurate medical histories that had previously been impossible to gather. Elena's presence seemed to reduce the time needed to treat these patients and improved their overall satisfaction with their hospital experience. Elena also began to see patterns in the types of injuries and illnesses affecting the immigrant community. Many patients worked in industries with high injury rates, such as construction, restaurant work, and manufacturing. Others suffered from health problems related to poor living conditions, inadequate nutrition, or delayed medical care. Elena started documenting these patterns, thinking they might be useful for improving community health outreach. One case particularly affected Elena during her second week on the job. A teenage girl named Maria had been brought in by police after being found unconscious in an abandoned building. As Elena worked to communicate with Maria, she realized that the girl's injuries and behavior suggested she had been trafficked and abused. Elena's own experience with violence and trauma helped her recognize the signs and respond appropriately. Elena worked closely with social workers and law enforcement to ensure Maria received not just medical care but also protection and support services. The case reminded Elena of her own vulnerability as a young refugee and reinforced her commitment to helping others who found themselves in dangerous situations far from home. As Elena settled into her new role, she began to feel a sense of purpose she had not experienced since her days working with Dr. Santos. She was using her skills to help people heal, both physically and emotionally, and she could see the direct impact of her work on patients' lives. The quiet satisfaction she felt at the end of each shift reminded her why she had been drawn to medical work in the first place. Sarah continued to check in on Elena regularly, and she could see how much happier her friend had become since returning to medical work. Elena's confidence had returned, and she seemed to have found a way to use her difficult past as a source of strength that could help others facing similar challenges. 6 months into her new position, Elena faced a situation that would test everything she had learned about healing, both for others and herself. On a busy Friday evening, the emergency room received multiple casualties from a gang shooting in a predominantly Latino neighborhood. Among the victims was a young man who had been shot multiple times and was fighting for his life. As Elena rushed to help with translation and patient care, she froze when she saw the young man's face. His name was Miguel, and he was the nephew of someone from Elena's past in El Salvador. Miguel's uncle had been one of the soldiers who had captured and tortured Elena during the Civil War. Elena recognized the family resemblance immediately, and the memories came flooding back with devastating intensity. For a moment, Elena could not move or speak. The sounds of the emergency room faded away, and she was transported back to that detention center decades ago. She could feel the pain in her hands and arms where Miguel's uncle had inflicted wounds that had left permanent scars. The face of the torturer, which Elena had tried so hard to forget, suddenly seemed to be staring back at her from Miguel's unconscious features. Dr. Martinez noticed Elena's distress and quickly pulled her aside. Elena was shaking and struggling to breathe normally. She tried to explain what was happening, but the words came out in a mixture of Spanish and English. Dr. Martinez recognized the signs of a panic attack and guided Elena to a quiet room where she could recover. As Elena slowly regained her composure, she faced an impossible moral dilemma. Miguel was dying, and the medical team needed her translation skills to communicate with his family members who had arrived at the hospital. But Elena did not know if she could face the family of the man who had caused her so much pain without breaking down completely. Elena's hands were still trembling as she thought about her options. She could ask another staff member to handle the translation, but there was no one else available who had her level of medical knowledge and cultural understanding. Miguel's family was clearly terrified and confused, and they needed someone who could help them understand what was happening to their loved one. After 20 minutes of internal struggle, Elena made her decision. She would put aside her personal trauma and do her job. Miguel was not responsible for his uncle's actions, and his family deserved the same compassionate care that Elena provided to all patients. Elena washed her face, straightened her scrubs, and returned to the emergency room. Elena approached Miguel's family with professional calm, introducing herself as the hospital's medical interpreter. Miguel's mother, grandmother, and several siblings were huddled together in the waiting area, crying and praying. Elena gently explained Miguel's condition and the procedures the medical team was performing to save his life. As Elena worked with Miguel's family, she learned more about their story. They had fled El Salvador just 2 years ago, escaping the same type of violence that Elena had experienced decades earlier. Miguel had been trying to stay away from gangs, but the shooting had occurred when he was in the wrong place at the wrong time. His family had no money for medical bills and were terrified that they would lose their. Santa Elena found herself feeling compassion for Miguel's family despite her complicated feelings about their connection to her past. She saw in Miguel's mother the same desperation and fear that she had seen in so many other mothers who had lost children to violence. Elena realized that the cycle of violence in El Salvador had continued long after she had escaped, and that Miguel's family were victims just as she had been. Elena stayed with Miguel's family throughout the night as he underwent multiple surgeries. She translated medical updates from the surgical team and helped the family understand the gravity of Miguel's condition. When Miguel's condition stabilized in the early morning hours, Elena was exhausted but felt a sense of accomplishment that surprised her. As Miguel's family prepared to keep vigil at his bedside, his grandmother took Elena's hand and thanked her for her kindness. The elderly woman's words were simple, but they carried deep gratitude for Elena's compassionate care during the family's darkest hours. Elena realized that helping Miguel's family had actually helped her heal from her own trauma in an unexpected way. Over the following days, Elena continued to work with Miguel's family as he slowly recovered from his injuries. She helped them navigate the complex hospital system, connect with social services, and understand Miguel's long-term medical needs. Elena also shared resources for trauma counseling and community support services that could help the family process their experiences. Through her work with Miguel's family, Elena began to understand that healing was not just about treating physical wounds, but also about breaking cycles of violence and trauma. Miguel's uncle had caused Elena tremendous pain, but Elena's response to Miguel's crisis had created an opportunity for healing rather than perpetuating harm. Elena also realized that her own healing journey was not complete. The panic attack she had experienced when seeing Miguel had shown her that she still carried trauma from her past that needed attention. Elena decided to seek counseling for herself, recognizing that taking care of her own mental health would make her more effective at helping others. Sarah noticed the change in Elena after the incident with Miguel. Elena seemed more thoughtful and introspective, but also more confident in her ability to handle difficult situations. Elena shared the story with Sarah, explaining how facing her past trauma in such an unexpected way had taught her important lessons about forgiveness and healing. The experience with Miguel's family became a turning point for Elena in her work at the hospital. She realized that her personal history of trauma, rather than being something to hide or overcome, could actually be a source of strength and wisdom that helped her connect with patients who had experienced similar difficulties. Elena began to see her role at the hospital not just as a job but as a calling that allowed her to transform her own painful experiences into healing for others. She understood now that her scars, both visible and invisible, were not just reminders of suffering but also evidence of her strength and resilience. 2 years after Elena had returned to medical work, she received an unexpected visitor at the hospital. Dr. Maria Santos, the physician who had trained Elena in the refugee camps decades earlier, had come to Chicago to attend a medical conference and had tracked down her former student. The reunion was emotional for both women, as they had not seen each other since Elena left Honduras for the United States. Dr. Santos was amazed to learn about Elena's journey from cleaning lady to medical interpreter and patient advocate. She listened with pride as Elena described the hundreds of patients she had helped and the impact she had made on the hospital's ability to serve the Latino community. Dr. Santos told Elena that she had always known her former student would find a way back to medical work because healing others was clearly Elena's true calling. During Dr. Santos's visit, Elena shared her idea for expanding her role at the hospital. She had been documenting the health patterns she observed in the immigrant community and had developed proposals for outreach programs that could prevent many emergency room visits. Elena wanted to create educational workshops about preventive care, workplace safety, and trauma recovery that would be specifically designed for Spanish-speaking immigrants. Dr. Santos was enthusiastic about Elena's ideas and offered to help her develop them further. She had connections with international health organizations that might provide funding for such programs, and she knew other medical professionals who had successfully implemented similar initiatives. Dr. Santos encouraged Elena to pursue formal certification that would allow her to expand her role even further. Elena's proposal for community health outreach was presented to the hospital administration and received strong support. The emergency room had seen a significant improvement in patient satisfaction and treatment outcomes since Elena had joined the staff, and the administration recognized the value of preventing health problems before they required emergency intervention. The hospital approved funding for Elena's pilot program, which would include health education workshops, workplace safety training, and support groups for trauma survivors. Elena would work with community organizations to reach people who might not otherwise have access to health education, focusing particularly on undocumented immigrants who were afraid to seek medical care. Elena's first workshop took place in a community center in the neighborhood where she lived. More than 50 people attended, including construction workers, restaurant employees, domestic workers, and their family members. Elena taught basic first aid, explained when to seek emergency medical care, and provided information about free and low-cost health services available in the city. The response to Elena's workshops was overwhelmingly positive. Participants appreciated learning from someone who shared their language, culture, and experiences. Elena's personal story of survival and recovery gave her credibility and helped participants trust her advice. Word of Elena's work spread throughout the Latino community in Chicago. Community leaders began inviting her to speak at churches, schools, and cultural centers. Elena found herself becoming an advocate not just for individual patients, but for the entire immigrant community's health and well-being. She testified before the city council about the need for better workplace safety enforcement and helped establish partnerships between the hospital and community organizations. Elena's trauma support groups became particularly successful. Many participants were dealing with violence, persecution, or the stress of living in a new country without legal documentation. Elena's ability to share her own experiences while maintaining professional boundaries helped create a safe space where people could begin to heal from their psychological wounds. One of Elena's most meaningful cases involved helping a family whose teenage daughter had been severely injured in a factory accident. The family was afraid to seek compensation because of their immigration status, but Elena connected them with legal advocates who specialized in workers' rights. The case resulted in improved safety conditions at the factory and financial support for the girl's medical treatment and rehabilitation. Sarah watched Elena's transformation with amazement and pride. Her friend had evolved from a quiet cleaning lady hiding her past to a respected community leader using her experiences to help others. Sarah often reflected on how a single moment of curiosity in an ambulance had led to such profound changes in Elena's life and in the lives of the people she served. Elena's work at the hospital and in the community began attracting attention from medical professionals and researchers interested in trauma-informed care and culturally competent medicine. She was invited to speak at conferences and to consult with other hospitals seeking to improve their services for immigrant populations. Elena's story became a powerful example of how personal trauma could be transformed into professional expertise that benefited entire communities. 5 years after the car accident that had brought Elena and Sarah together, Elena received notification that she had been selected to receive a community service award from the mayor of Chicago. The recognition honored her contributions to public health and her advocacy for immigrant rights. Elena was invited to attend a ceremony at City Hall, where she would be recognized alongside other community leaders. As Elena prepared for the award ceremony, she thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment. From the torture chambers of El Salvador to the refugee camps of Central America, from the quiet life of a cleaning lady to the respected position of a medical advocate, Elena's path had been marked by both tremendous suffering and remarkable resilience. Elena decided to use her acceptance speech to honor all the people who had helped her along the way. She spoke about Dr. Santos, who had first taught her to heal others. She thanked Sarah, whose curiosity and compassion had helped her find her way back to medical work. She acknowledged the countless patients and community members who had trusted her with their stories and their pain. But most importantly, Elena used the platform to speak about the thousands of immigrants who were still struggling in silence, afraid to seek help and support. She called for more programs to address their needs and for greater understanding of the trauma and resilience that defined so many immigrant experiences. After the ceremony, Elena returned to her apartment and looked at the award sitting on her small kitchen table. She thought about the scars on her body that had once been sources of shame and fear, but had become symbols of her strength and survival. Elena understood now that her wounds had always been part of her story, but they did not define her limits. Instead, they had become the foundation for her ability to help others heal. Elena picked up the phone and called Sarah to share the news about the award. As they talked, both women reflected on how much their lives had changed since that day in the ambulance when Sarah had first noticed Elena's scars. What had begun as a medical emergency had evolved into a friendship that had transformed both of their understanding of healing, resilience, and the power of human connection. Elena's story had come full circle. The woman who had once been tortured for her beliefs had become a healer, who used her experiences to help others find hope and recovery. Her scars, once hidden in shame, had become the foundation for a career dedicated to helping others overcome their own trauma and find their way to healing. The room had indeed gone quiet when the medic realized Elena's hidden history, but that silence had led to a conversation that changed everything.